Hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again with another random thoughts video. This particular video is I guess the closest I'll ever get to doing a reaction video. What I wanted to do is just really articulate my thoughts and some things I've been considering in reaction to quite a few YouTube videos I've seen popping up over the last kind of few months or the last 6 months or so, really saying things like this is the best place to start reading Fantastic Four or best place to start reading the X-Men, etc., etc. And that's great. I'm all for positive videos that will say things like here are 10 great entry points for this particular series. But what I want to do in this video is highlight why some of those recommendations don't really hang together and why some of those recommendations are actually really terrible. And I'll explain why. But then at the end of the video, like I often do, I'll just provide a counterpoint explaining why my perspective is just my perspective and why you can and maybe should ignore it. So with no further ado, let's jump in. Where are the common places that people say you should start reading the X-Men? Well, to start off with, Giant Size X-Men. This is the issue from 1975 where we see the modern X-Men for the first time. We see Wolverine, etc., etc. It's a really famous issue. It's a really famous jumping on point. It's issue one, so it's where everything starts. And people often say jump in here is a great place to start. It sort of is, but it's way back in 1975. I mean, the writing and the drawing and so on. If you're into your retro comics, great. But if you're a modern reader and you're getting into comics, this is going to feel clunky and terrible. It's going to be just hard going, and even a lot of serious omnibus collectors and omnibus fans and X-Men fans that I know start reading here and get about 30 or 40 issues in, and then they just kind of tail off and they're like, actually, this is just a grind. So unless you're already really into Silver Age and Bronze Age comics, don't start with Giant Size X-Men number one. It's hard going. It kind of makes sense in terms of continuity, but it's generally not a read that a lot of people find enjoyable from a modern perspective. Speaking of a modern perspective, another common entry point people say is Ultimate X-Men. Now, I think this is a great idea. Ultimate X-Men is definitely a good place to start. The Ultimate line of comics was originally intended as like a reboot and a rejig of the X-Men. However, the one caveat I would have here is this isn't the Marvel 616 X-Men. If you're wondering what I mean by 616, I have a separate video on one of my playlists talking about the multiverses. But long story short, this is a multiverse story. This is the Ultimate Universe, which has its own number and its own numbering system. In other words, if you're not familiar with multiverses, this is basically a parallel universe with the X-Men that we know and love, but in a parallel universe. They're different ages, they're different characters, they behave in a different way. And keep in mind, Ultimate X-Men only ran for about 100 issues. So whilst it's a relatively closed, self-contained story within the wider Ultimate parallel universe, if you're going to get into X-Men here, you're going to get into it and you're going to get out of it. You're going to run through all 100 issues and then be like, well, where do I go from here? And then you're basically back to square one looking at somewhere else to jump on, because this is its own closed parallel universe or multiverse. It's a good read. I really enjoy it and I've got it. And it's probably quite a good place to start. But keep in mind, this is just going to teach you the foundational ABCs. You're still going to have to pick up main universe X-Men at some point and dive in. Speaking of which, another thing that people recommend is X-Men First Class. I'll be honest, I haven't read the X-Men First Class comics. There's quite a few of them. I think like 100 or so. Um, I think this is sort of like an early years of the X-Men sort of thing. X-Men New Class, X-Men First Class, that sort of thing, with them as teenagers and, like a prequel sort of thing. I don't know. I haven't read it. It's up to you whether or not you want to jump in there. And then another one that people often recommend is House of M, or the House of M era, which kind of span out of the House of M event by Brian Michael Bendis back in 2000 and I want to say 2003, 2004. And often people say this is a good place to jump in. It is. It's quite a nice starting point, and it leads into Messiah Complex, which is an event, and then Second Coming, and eventually all the way up to kind of Avengers versus X-Men. You see that the bedrock being laid here in House of M. That said, if you jump into it as someone who is just familiar with the cartoons and maybe just familiar with the movies, House of M is a grim and gritty place to start. It's heavy going. It's enjoyable, but it's intense. And there's a lot there where, whilst it's a good jumping on point, it's kind of emotionally a bit taxing. But yeah, fair enough. It could be a good jumping on point. Let's look at some of the ones that aren't so great at jumping on points. And I will point out, I love a lot of the stories I'm about to say. So the first one is people talk about Grant Morrison's X-Men as a really good jumping on point for the X-Men. It sort of is, but it sort of isn't, because it really relies upon understanding more about the X-Men as a whole and understanding some of the history. What Grant Morrison does is, whilst he establishes a lot of new concepts, a lot of those concepts are just riffing and playing about with and toying with the older concepts. So I'll put it this way: if you start reading Grant Morrison's X-Men, and you've never read X-Men before, one of the things that you'll just see is eventually you realize that Sentinels, the X-Men hunting robots, are like nanotechnology. They're tiny in size. And you're like, oh, cool, that's just a threat, and that's something the X-Men have to deal with. But the reason Grant Morrison does so well in terms of creating this story is that Sentinels originally in original X-Men were gigantic robots. They were 7 stories high, that sort of thing. So subverting that kind of understanding of what this particular threat is and inverting it works really well if you know historically what the Sentinels were, and that theme is kind of carried through the whole of his X-Men. There's things where it references an ancient asteroid base that Magneto used to own, and it references all these other kind of subtle things where if you don't get it, you don't get it. It's fine, you can still read it. But Morrison's X-Men really is a very tight capstone on the X-Men of the 90s, and so in that sense, I'm not convinced it's a brilliant jumping on point. It's decent, by all means, it's decent, and I love it, and I love the series. But a lot of what I got out of Morrison was because I already knew quite a lot about X-Men. Straight after Morrison's X-Men, you have Joss Whedon's X-Men, or Astonishing X-Men run, rather. Everyone's a big fan of this. They rave on about how good it is, and it has got some great moments. But again, it relies upon you knowing some previous stuff about what's happened with the X-Men. If you don't know what the legacy virus was, and if you don't know who was killed by it and how it got cured and that sort of stuff, some of the denouement points in Whedon's run will just be a mystery to you. You'll be like, is this a big deal? So in that sense, Whedon's run again, it builds upon previous knowledge and previous kind of understanding of the X-Men. So it's okay as a standalone, but a lot of the depth and the narrative nuance relies upon a greater, broader foundational understanding of X-Men. Moving on, Age of Apocalypse. This is a mid-90s event for the X-Men. It was really cool. It lasted for 4 months. All the X-Men comics were stopped and they were rebooted in a parallel universe of the Age of Apocalypse. And then after 4 months of that, everything goes back to normal as it always does. But it had loads of cool repercussions, loads of cool twists. Long story short, this is a terrible place to jump into the X-Men. Do not start here. And the reason I say that is that the Age of Apocalypse is kind of like Ultimate X-Men in the sense it's a parallel universe, it's an alternate reality. And in that reality, good guys are bad guys are good guys, people in different relationships. So to give you an example, Sabretooth, who's a horrific X-Men villain in the 90s, is a really good guy, like an absolute hero and a legend and one of my favorite Marvel characters of all time in the Age of Apocalypse. But if you're just reading the Age of Apocalypse, you're like, oh, cool, he's like some heroic guy. It's only when you read it and you realize, oh, this is someone who is the worst of the worst, psychopathic, serial killing lunatic. And then in Age of Apocalypse, he's amazing. He's really cool and he's really noble and really heroic. And it's that juxtaposition and the tension between those two depictions of the same character that make Age of Apocalypse so good. If you haven't read anything up until Age of Apocalypse, and as a brand new, fresh X-Men reader, you jump in there, you'll be like, oh, right, okay, cool, yeah, so Wolverine's got one hand. Wonder how that happened. Oh, Sabretooth's a good guy. Oh, I assume he's always been a good guy. Like, you don't realize that there's so much nuance and intrigue and exciting exploration of the different characters that Age of Apocalypse allowed writers to do. So I would really not recommend this as a good place to jump in. Speaking of stuff that sort of relies upon previous characterizations, Schism. I've heard people recommending Schism, which is kind of the build up to the Avengers versus X-Men event. Schism is essentially, long story short, Cyclops and Wolverine have beef, kick off, and they split the X-Men into 2 different teams. That's very much a potted summary of what that story is. A lot of people say it's a good place to start. I can see what they mean. It's a nice, clean place to start. But having said that, unless you are familiar with the Cyclops and Wolverine dynamic from the earlier stories from the 80s, from the 90s, and so on, the fact that they just meet and they hate each other and then they split into separate schools doesn't have anything kind of the potency and the evocative characterization that happens if you know more about these characters. So again, if you're jumping in, I wouldn't recommend Schism. Okay, that's a little sort of series of kind of negative things where I've said these aren't good places to jump in. I guess it's only fair if I say now where I particularly started reading the X-Men. And personally, my X-Men starts with Bishop's Crossing. Now, Bishop's Crossing is an issue of Uncanny X-Men, and it's actually with the arrival of the character Lucas Bishop from the future. And literally, for me, that is the point I start reading X-Men. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. One, I don't read anything earlier than the 90s, so I don't read any comics from the 80s or before, with very, very few exceptions. So for me, I'm a 90s reader. Um, Even 1991, which is when Bishop's Crossing happens, is a kind of early for me. I'm kind of more of like a 1994, 1995 is where my comic collection really begins. But Bishop's Crossing for me is a great place to start. It does require you to be kind of flexible with your mind because it does still refer to a lot of previous stuff. But at the same time, for me, it feels like a really good starting point. I'm really looking forward to the Bishop's Crossing and Fatal Attractions reprints if and when they ever get announced. Um, if you're unhappy with jumping in the middle of Uncanny X-Men issue 200 and whatever it is for Bishop's Crossing, then at the same time, December 1991, is when X-Men issue 1 by Jim Lee got released. This is X-Men sort of volume or series 2, if you want to look at it like that. And issue 1 came out, drawn by Jim Lee, and it's a great place to start. Again, it does require you to have some understanding of what mutants are, who Magneto is, what the X-Men are. But for me, for my money, this is what I jump in. It is not a perfect recommendation by any means, but this is just for me what I personally would recommend. With all that out of the way, I now just want to circle back and just highlight the worst place to jump into the X-Men as a brand new X-Men reader. And that is a place that I see a lot of people recommending, which is the Jonathan Hickman HOXPOX reboot. Now, I should probably clarify what I mean here. HOXPOX stands for House of X Powers of 10. So HOXPOX. It's a hardcover you can get that combines the two miniseries, HOXPOX, and their specific reading order. It's a really good hardcover. It's a great story. I absolutely love HOXPOX. And what the House of 10 Powers of X crossover led into is then Dawn of X, Reign of X, Destiny of X, Legion of X, all the different X stories. Now, HOXPOX happened in about 2019. And so a lot of people go, this is a brilliant place to start because it's a brand new era for the mutants. Everything is kind of reset back to step one. It reintroduces loads of new things. It introduces loads of brand new concepts. It's a great place to start. And I would massively disagree. It's a great read and it's fantastic. And whilst I've only read HOXPOX, I cannot wait to get some time together and do a whole run through of the entirety of what they're now calling the Krakoa era of X-Men or the Hickman era of X-Men. However, if you're not used to X-Men, if you're not familiar with them, and actually what I say is if you're not very familiar with them, do not start reading HOXPOX. What do I mean by that? Why am I saying that? Well, it's for this reason. There are so many things in House of X, Powers of 10, that rely upon you having really detailed, comprehensive knowledge of previous stuff that happened in X-Men. Hickman is mining a rich vein of X-Men lore way back from the 70s, stuff from literally giant size X-Men issue 1 all the way through Legion Quest and Fatal Attractions and Age of Apocalypse and Zero Tolerance, all the way through to House of M and Messiah Complex, Avengers vs. X-Men. There are so many themes and callbacks and Easter eggs and so many evocative, clever things. And I don't want to sound pretentious here, he did an astonishing job of retrospective recontextualization. Now, I've got an entire other long video in my Vocabulary of Comics series about what that concept is, but ultimately, what Hickman does is he reveals a particular thing about the X-Men, which then provides all the history of the X-Men. Everything from 1975 till the 2019 comics when House of X started. Suddenly it's viewed in a different way. Everything is viewed in a different perspective. It provides a brand new context. It recontextualizes all of it, including Age of Apocalypse, including Fatal Attraction, including Morrison's X-Men. If you ever wondered why it is Magneto keeps on dying and keeps on coming back, it's all explained in House of X. But if you haven't read all those stories and then you just read House of X for the first time, you'll be like, oh, well, yeah, that was clever. But that's not what it is. It's not clever. It's genius. But it takes an understanding of the wider context of it to understand why it's so much genius. So I guess there's one thing you take away from this video. It's this: if you're new to X-Men, do not read House of X Powers of 10. It's a great starting point because it's clean and it's in theory relatively self-contained, but you will be doing yourself a disservice because you will not understand so much of the depth and the nuance and the Easter eggs related to that story that I strongly wouldn't recommend starting there. Um, so again, just to recap, I guess a good place to start is Giant Size X-Men, I suppose. Ultimate X-Men, I guess. X-Men First Class, I've no idea. House of M, if you fancy something gritty and hardcore to start with. And personally, I start with Bishop's Crossing and X-Men #1 by Jim Lee. A lot of the other places that people recommend are, in my mind, sort of shortchanged if you read them without knowing more about the X-Men having started earlier. But that said, I just want to quickly pause for a second because I am conscious that all I've done is just say that where there are places that aren't good to start reading the X-Men. And really, I guess a good question here is, like, do I even have the right to have this opinion? Like what am I saying? Is it worth listening to me? And I'm going to argue that maybe it's not. And the reason I'm going to say that is I've recently watched all 5 Daniel Craig James Bond movies. I know this seems like a random thing to say, but just bear with me. If you watch the Daniel Craig James Bond movies, it's a reboot of James Bond. From Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, Skyfall, all the way up until Spectre. And then suddenly in Spectre, what you then discover is that, and by the way, there's going to be spoilers here, so if you don't want spoilers for a 15-year-old James Bond franchise, then tune out now. But when you get to the 4th movie, when you get to Spectre, what happens is you realize that there's a singular antagonist who is revealed in Spectre and is the organization Spectre, in fact, that was the author of all of James Bond's sadness. It was the organization behind the events of Casino Royale, behind the events of Quantum of Solace, and behind the events of Skyfall. So that's all good. You can read that as you can watch that as a series from Casino Royale onwards. But when you get to Spectre, you find out that the antagonist, the villain there, is actually Blofeld. And it's Christopher Waltz playing Blofeld, and he's got like a hidden supervillain lair, and he does a thing where he's wearing the cool kind of minimalist, I suppose like Japanese clothes, and they're like the little soft shoes, and he's got the little furry cat, and he's got his little laser weapon to torture people with, and all that sort of stuff. Um, and then at the end of the movie, he's got the scar across one eye, just like Blofeld. If you're suddenly got lost and you're like, what am I talking about? It's because that reboot, all those 4 movies up to Spectre, and even including No Time to Die, they're all evocative of the original Thunderball series of James Bond movies. Those are the movies with Sean Connery and Roger Moore and the classics, the ones with the ultimate archetypal villains. And these really are sort of definitive spy schlocky 70 villains. Like, they've been riffed on so much they're almost a caricature of themselves. Austin Powers riffed on it all the time with Dr. Evil and all his various kind of evil lairs and henchmen and so on. But it all started with Blofeld way back in the 60s and 70s. This was the original villain with the big chair and the stroking the cat and the evil plans and plots and the scar across his face. He was the original, and like the original James Bond films had that. If you haven't watched any James Bond movies at all and you start with Casino Royale, what you have is a series of 5 movies that are totally self-contained, and they're decent, and they're quite clever in and of themselves. In Spectre, it kind of recontextualizes some of the previous movies, and yeah, that's fine, that's great. But if you've watched a lot more James Bond, if you've watched stuff from before Casino Royale, if you watch the movies from the 60s and the 70s, when you're watching the reboot and you suddenly get to the movie Spectre, your mind gets blown. You're like, oh my God, this is not only is a cool film, this is a cool film rebooting the old villains and the old archetypes. Oh my God, it's so clever. And I think a lot of people that watch those James Bond movies watch them as the first James Bond movies they'd really seen. I mean, maybe they'd seen some of the Pierce Brosnan ones, but they don't count. My point is, if you watch them from Casino Royale onwards, it's a good entry point for the James Bond franchise, and you can watch all 5 movies, and that's fine. But at the same time, you're kind of robbing yourself of some of the power of some of those revelations and some of that exposition by the fact that you don't know more about the old classic James Bond from the 60s and the 70s and stuff, which it's riffing on it, it's referencing it, it's providing Easter eggs to all that. So I guess it's a long-winded way of me saying that James Bond, the recent franchise with Daniel Craig, it is a good jumping on point. But if you jump on there, you're not going to quite get how clever it is until you know a little bit more about James Bond. But I guess you've got to jump on somewhere. And the Daniel Craig movies are decent. That series of five worked quite well, and it was enjoyable. I watched it with my partner, first time she'd ever seen these James Bond movies. She had no idea who Blofeld was or any of the history of James Bond, so she just thought it was cool. I did bore her to death afterwards explaining why it was so clever, and she just told me to stop talking. But my point is, there's a lot to be said about understanding more of the background context and the history to a story. And obviously, when I'm talking about X-Men, that's what I'm talking about. I'm like, well, you can't jump into Morrison's X-Men or the Age of Apocalypse without understanding the background and the history. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can just jump in and enjoy it for what it is. And then later on, maybe you'll pick up more of that background history yourself, but maybe you won't. That's up to you. And really, that's what comics are. It's whatever you find enjoyable. So I'm just going to draw a line under it here. What I want to say, I think the one thing I can say quite firmly is House of X Powers of 10 is not a good place to start the X-Men. The rest of the series that I've had a quick chat through, some of them are better than others. All of them require some degree of background knowledge, and you'll never have enough because there is no perfect way to read comics. Um, so when you do go into them, even if you start somewhere like the Age of Apocalypse, go into it just being aware some of the points, some of the cleverness, some of the nuance will go over your head the first time. But as you read more about comics, as you learn more about X-Men, as you dive in here and there, and I don't read chronologically. I just pick a series here or an era there or an author there, and I just read as and when. I kind of slot it together in my head. If you adopt that kind of approach, when you come back and you reread Whedon's X-Men or Age of Apocalypse or things like that, you'll find it a richer and more fulfilling narrative experience. And I guess that's the beauty of reading comics. There is no perfect way to read them. Do it however you like and enjoy. I'd love to hear your thoughts of what you think about a good place to read the X-Men or a bad place to read the X-Men might be. Please comment down below. And until next time, everyone, please support the channel by going to No Gods or Kings and stay classy. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. As always, please follow me on Twitter at I am Thomas Judge, where I will post a daily review of whatever comics I've been reading. You can get an idea of what I'm up to on the channel. And as always, please support the channel by heading over to Amazon.com and checking out my prose novel about superheroes. It's a completely original piece of work. The first episode in it is called Arrivals, and the series as a whole is called No Gods or Kings. You can find an excerpt of that on my website, nogodsorkings.com. Until next time, everybody, stay classy.